Okay, great. So we've all had a little bit of coffee and now we're ready to go for the final session of the day. So welcome back. We have 4 papers in this session. My name is Aphra Kerr. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology in Maynooth University in Ireland. I'm very happy to chair this session. And we have 3 of our colleagues here in the room and then 2 other colleagues joining us for the final paper and they're on screen behind me. So we have about 15 minutes max for each contribution, and I will be wandering around and giving a little bit of waving as you come up to time. You'll probably see me walk into your eye line. You can give your paper there, or if you wish to come to the podium, I think as you wish, really. So our first speaker today, looking at economic concentration in the French multimedia and communication markets, is Bruno Lefevre from the Université Sorbonne Paris Nord-LabEx.
Hi, thank you, and it's really a great pleasure for me to be with you today. So I'm working on for the GMIC project on the French markets. Today I won't give a global overview or a bird's-eye view, as told some minutes ago, but I will tell you a story in a small and far away country, but emerging economic concentration ongoing story, which raises economic issues, of course, but also social and in terms of public regulation. Next slide, please. First slide. So I'm focusing today on a recent phenomenon of financial and economical concentration in the sectors of media and audiovisual contents production and distribution in France. More precisely, I would like to highlight the impacts of the Bolloré Group strategy for less than 10 years on these markets through financial and market share dimensions, but also through socio-economical, legal, cultural, and ethical dimensions. First, let me quickly introduce 3 of the local major companies which dominate the French audiovisual and media markets since the 2000s, the groups Vivendi, Lagardère, and Bolloré. And let's see how the Bolloré Group's financial strategy, driven by one person, Vincent Bolloré, achieved recently to make it a dominant economic actor in several sectors, the biggest accepted public groups like France Télévisions and Radio France. Next slide, please. So first of the 3 companies, the Lagardère Group. Officially, the Lagardère Group was founded in 1992, but on the basis of several activities, in particular Matra company, and which activities were in industrial systems, and Hachette, which is a major edition and distribution actor. The group has an international activity in 40 countries nowadays. You have some revenues, 5.13 billion euros revenues in 21. About 30% of these revenues are made in France, on the French market. Next slide, please. These activities are mainly publishing, with Hachette, which was founded in 1830. Technologies with Matra, which is still a big company, the news, travel retail, and also live entertainment. The CEO of the group, Arnaud Lagardère, decided heavy investments in media and communications, especially TV, in the 80s. And in 20 and 22, after a progressive increase of participation in the capital, Vivendi Group becomes a controlling shareholder of the Lagardère Group. Next slide, please. The second company is Vivendi. Vivendi was founded in 1953, also from industrial activities, and then developed water distribution. There was the Compagnie Générale des Eaux, or Water General Company, which was very active in France, and industrial service through Dalkia Society, for example. The group has an international presence too, in about 100 countries, with 9.5 billion euros in 21, and about 35% of these revenues were made in France. In the 90s, Vivendi CEO, Jean-Marie Messier, decided also heavy investments in ICT, in telecoms with CGTEL, for example, advertising and publishing with Havas and Editis. We are major companies in France, but also in other countries worldwide. In media with the group Canal+, in internet service provider with AOL and SFR, America Online and SFR, music and video games production, ticketing live. You see a large panel of activities in communication sectors. And in the 20s, Vivendi acquires Universal Company with music, the studios, the video games. After a bankrupt in 22, despite a strategy of controlling content production to diffusion via cable networks and TV channels. The next slide. Vivendi is still now a part of the biggest content providers worldwide, thanks to a vertical integration mass media worldwide strategy. And in 2018, Bolloré Group becomes the controlling shareholder of the Vivendi Group. And in 2022, nowadays, Vivendi acquires 57% shares of the Lagardère Group. Next slide. Third actor, for its part, the Bolloré Group was founded in 1822, initially in the paper and plastic industry. The group has an international presence in energy, transport, mainly in Africa, logistics sectors in 130 countries, and its revenue worldwide is about 20 billion euros in 21. In the 90s and beginning of the 21st century, Vincent Bolloré, the CEO, has decided a diversification of the activities of a group, notably in finance, insurance sectors, transportation, communication, press, TV, cinema, video games with Gameloft, polling, with the CSA, which is the biggest polling institute in France, and telecom. The next slide. So you can see from 2018 to 22, the Bolloré Group increases its financial participation in Vivendi, which now represent about 50% of the group revenues, in particular with Canal+, Havas, and Editis. So Bolloré's strategy makes the group controlling leadership in groups Lagardère and Vivendi today in 2022. Next slide. After these short presentations, which highlight a strong financial and economic concentration in several communication sectors, let's see the forms and the impacts of this concentration phenomenon on two sectors strongly concerned, the book edition and distribution, and the audiovisual and media contents. Next slide, please. First, the book edition. The global market in France is about 5.8 billion euros in 2019. 10 leaders companies make about 90% of the global market revenues, and it's increasing. As you can see, it was 77% in 2012, sorry. So there's an increasing weight for these leaders. Since the 2010s, the number of independent editors with revenues over 1 million euros is decreasing. Hachette, which belonged to the group Lagardère, and Editis, which belonged to the group Vivendi, with 52 about edition companies, represent about 45 to 60% of the books and papers edition market share in 21, and 40% of the sector's employees. Hachette Distribution and Interforum, which are related to Editis company, represent about 60 to 70% of the market of distribution in France. So you have two dominant companies, Hachette and Editis, under the control of one group, which is the Bolloré Group, for the edition and the distribution of books. Next slide, please. You can see here the market shares in 21, and you can see that Hachette and Editis have about 50% of the market. You have big difference between the kind of edition, the youth literature. It's really a big sector for this group. So let's remember, in 22, Bolloré, via its control of Lagardère, so the Hachette and Vivendi Editis, would become a dominant actor for the economy of edition and overall for the distribution of books. We will see in a minute how the European and French regulation influence this financial and economical concentration. Indeed, Bolloré has been forced to respect non-monopoly rules, to sell Editis and to keep Hachette, which is the first group of edition in France and with a worldwide influence. Next slide. The second market I would like to highlight is a big market gathering information and cultural contents, production and distribution. More specifically, let's begin with the media sector. At the moment, about 10 billionaires control 90% of the sales of national daily newspapers in France, 55% of television audience, and about 40% of radio audience. You can see this map. It's not really clear for you, sorry, it's small, but you can see this map which was built by the newspaper Le Monde Diplomatique in 2017 and in 2017, sorry, and in 2022. It's hard to see, but even if the number of media and the media companies is quite the same, the audience of some channels have increased significantly. Next slide, please. And of course, the history of private channels in France, in particular TF1 and Canal+, is long and exciting, highlighted by authors like Bernard Miège or Philippe Bouquillon more recently in a book dedicated to Vivendi. But the private channels with the biggest audiences, free or by subscription, now belong to a few groups, and among them the channels of the group Canal+ and the channels like CNews, which both belong to Bolloré Group. Next slide. You can see on this, maybe the next again, one more, yeah. This is a map made by the CNC, the National Center for the Cinema in France, which is a public institution in 2021, which figures the financial relationships in cinema and audiovisual sectors in France. And you can see that the Bolloré Group and some groups like TF1 and M6 control most of this market. Next slide. So from these elements, some questions raised. First, how public policies can influence this concentration dynamics at the European or at the national level. The balance is hard to find for policymakers between protecting European and national markets from the domination of international players on the one side, and on the other side, avoiding dominant positions for national or European groups in regards of an economic diversity. Indeed, in front of the French state, as a part of a commission of inquiry into media concentration, Vincent Bolloré tells that its financial and industrial strategy is motivated by the necessity to fight against the international groups like Netflix, Amazon, Meta, Google, Disney, with regards to contents, and also against GAFAM with regards to advertising online. The European directives for some years tend to regulate these markets, but at the same time, liberal governments and policies contribute to increase the domination of a few actors, private actors. As you know, the cultural exception, supported by French governments for about 50 years, made possible to have big public actors, TV channels, or for production. In 2022, one of the tools which made possible to partly support production with public funds, the public audiovisual tax, is about to be abolished. Next slide, please. More specifically, for media contents, the financial and economic concentration raises issues about the political and ideological diversity. The merging cases mentioned a few minutes ago, particularly in the context of Bolloré's strategy, have caused numerous crises in TV, radio, and print editorial departments. Some channels have been forced to broadcast content produced by others, pulled together, and often supervised by new managers who are considered to have similar liberal, even reactionary vision of society. This also poses ethical problems for journalists and professionals. We saw this during the last presidential election in France with the promotion of a candidate Éric Zemmour from extreme right, which was explicitly supported by Vincent Bolloré. But this question also concerned groups as TF1 or M6, which are seeking to merge in order to have more weight in terms of audience, but also in terms of selling advertising space. This economic dynamic of concentration also concerned public-supported channels, especially for online broadcasting. Indeed, free TV channels, France Télévisions, which is a public TV channels, TF1 and M6, or private channels, have joined forces in 2019 to offer a more competitive content package through Salto, an online platform that offers SVOD services with shared documents. That's my conclusion. Next, please. So in conclusion, some remarks and questions to be discussed and compared with other local markets. First question, is this dominant company's strategy a financial strategy or an economical strategy, including a growing influence on contents, whatever they are, information and media contents or cultural contents? And the second main issue is the capacity for public policies and social organizations to regulate what is considered as well as a sensitive and ideological sector for the country as a strategic tool to increase the country's influence worldwide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bruno, for your punctuality. Okay, I'd like to invite our second speaker, and this is Josef Trappel from the University of Salzburg, who's going to talk about local market global players, media concentration, and ownership over time and space in 8 European countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aphra. Well, we have heard this morning and during this conference quite a lot of numbers, and we have dealt with figures with regard to concentration ratios and HHI indices, and I got a bit nervous during this morning session, and the longer it took, the more nervous I became. And I got a bit more relaxed in the after lunch session because we addressed the reason why we should be concerned about concentration more than in the morning sessions. In other words, I'm much more interested in why is media concentration a problem and what kind of problem does media concentration really produce than in the numbers themselves. I know that they are important. I know that you can make a case with numbers, and you need the numbers in order to argue in the public. So in that sense, there is a lot of merit in what has been done by Ellie over decades, what has been done by Twain and other researchers all over the planet. So this is important. Nonetheless, I think we need to be very clear why we do think that media concentration is a problem, and this is what I would like to talk about this afternoon for a couple of minutes. And I would like to introduce to you, and maybe you know it already, this kind of project we have been doing over the last 2 years, which is called Media for Democracy Monitor. And the idea of the project actually is to look at mature democracies, that's the first condition, and there find out what do leading news media actually contribute to the values of a contemporary democracy. It is kind of a given that media are good for democracy. And we wanted to challenge that and say, is that really the case? Media can damage democracy as well. So in that sense, we developed a system of indicators where we empirically look at what did the leading news media in these countries actually do to the values of contemporary democracy. Now, what you can see here in the first slide is the publications we have been producing this year. So this is 2022. There are 2 volumes of the Yellow Book, Media for Democracy Monitor, and there we cover not less than 18 countries worldwide. So this is a huge research project, actually. And the blue book on the right side, which has been published about 3 months ago, is the horizontal discussion of the problems we have identified there. So there you will find chapters, for example, on media concentration. And this is what I'm going to talk about now. So can we see the next chart, please? Okay, these are the books. The two ones in the middle are 2022, and the book on the left-hand side is 2011. This is an exercise we have been doing 10 years ago as well, and now we can have this longitudinal comparative research among the participating countries over 10 years' time. So what has happened in these 10 years between 2011 and 2021, which was the year when we did our research? It was a decade, let's put it in a nutshell, it was a decade of digitalization. So one could expect as a researcher that during these 10 years, digitalization has totally disrupted the media industry in many respects. So this was kind of the hypothesis or assumption when we started our project in 2021. Next, please. Now, here are, just to give you a brief idea, here are the indicators we have been using. So based on a theoretical model, there are 3 different types or dimensions, as we call them, of indicators. You can see them here. Freedom of information was one group. Another one is equality and interest mediation. This is what media should do for a healthy democracy. And the third one is control and watchdog. This is kind of investigative reporting. Do media indeed challenge the powerful in society? Do they do a great job in being the watchdogs of our democracy? So these are the 3 elements here. And if you click on the next one, please, then you can see that we have media and concentration as one of these indicators. So there are 2 indicators out of the 30 indicators dealing with media concentration, so I'm going to show you these one in detail. Next, please. Here is the first one, and this is how we went forward in the project. You can see here, this is one indicator. It's called media ownership concentration, national level. And there, the question is, what is the degree of ownership concentration at the national level? And we assume that the lower the national ownership concentration, the more democratic equality is guaranteed, and the higher the potential that democracy will be promoted. So the idea is, the higher the concentration, the more problematic for democracy it gets. So we had a look to, in all these countries, how the level of media concentration currently is, and then we gave them points. That's the points here. So 3 points if the concentration is low, and 0 points if there is a private monopoly. And the points in between is 1 and 2, as you can see here, is in the middle between those. So what we did is for all these 18 countries, we asked national teams to look at the concentration data and give these kind of points. Next one, please. There is a second indicator, and that's similar to the first one, and that's the regional or local level. I learned in the project that regional is a term which is difficult, because sometimes region means Latin America. What we mean here is the local level underneath the national one. So like a state in the United States or a canton in Switzerland or something like that below the national level. And there we ask the same question, and there we say, okay, how is the situation at the regional or in that case, local level? We touched upon this earlier today when we talked about the national and the regional level. There is a lot of difference. And I would like to show you now the results of our research. So if you go to the next slide, we can see that. So in 2021, we had these European countries here. You can see listed. And just for the fun of it, I added Canada, because Canada is also part of the sample. So on the very right side, you can see the numbers for Canada. Now, you can see, and now please give me the figures, that our national teams consider that in most cases, the concentration level gets 2 points, which means it's okay. It's not a serious problem, but it's not supporting democracy either. So in that sense, you can see at the national level, there are mostly 2s and a few 1s. So 1 would indicate in that country at the national level, there is a high level of concentration. And you see very few 3s where the researchers think that's okay. So the concentration level supports democracy. You find this in Portugal at the local level, interesting enough, and in Canada as well at the local level. So it seems that in Canada, the local level is not a problem with regard to media concentration, at least according to our researchers in Canada. Now what we can do is we can compare these figures and these points to 2011. If you click next, please. And then you can see the differences. So in 2011, we had these 8 countries in the sample again. And what you can see here is that the difference is very minor. So over these 10 years, media concentration with regard to democracy did not really change. There is only one change in the Netherlands, if you see there, that the Netherlands do think that the national concentration increased over time in these years, and it is now a more important problem than before. In most other countries, the change is minor. To us, this is an interesting finding. So against the expectations we had that media concentration increased and it increased the problem for democracy, it doesn't show in our data. So we do have a certain level of media concentration, but digitalization and the appearance of the GAFAM companies did not change the picture radically. So if we go now to a little more qualitative findings, next please, then we can see some countries I would like to introduce to you very briefly. So Italy, for example, they say that the landscape shows moderate concentration, and we have a few companies which are dominant, like Gedi and La Stampa. In the UK, thank you, you can see that the ownership concentration in newspaper industry has increased in the recent years. So just 3 daily newspapers account for 72% of all revenues. The same goes for the commercial radio market. And we can see that the BBC has a specific and particular role to play there. So what we see is that we have few strong companies, and DGM, for example, or the three publishing companies are the News Corp, of course, with Sun and Times in the UK. Then we had Reach PLC with the Mirror Group and the Express and Daily Star Group. And then we have the DMG, and the UK friends know this much better than I do, with the Daily Mail. Now, in Germany, we have, that's the largest European country, as you know, with regard to the audience. We have a highly concentrated TV audience market concentration with basically 2 groups. One is the Bertelsmann Group, which is a worldwide company, and the other one is the Pro7 Sat1 Group, which is now controlled by an American investor who has bought a considerable number of shares, together with Berlusconi from Italy, who holds 25% of Pro7 Sat1. So these are the large countries. And the next slide, please. Maybe you can show all these countries just immediately. Yeah. You can find here the smaller countries in Europe. And the smaller countries are stronger affected actually by media concentration than the larger ones. This is a general finding. For example, in Austria, outside of Vienna, there is basically no competition anymore. So in the local level in Austria, you just have one dominant newspaper and the public service broadcaster who has a local outlet there. And for other countries, the number 3 is important, because it turned out that in many markets, there are just 3 competitors left. Before there have been many more, but in many countries, they have only 3 competitors. In several markets. For example, in Finland, as you can see there in the middle, this is a highly concentrated market with just 3 groups left, one of which is Sanoma, which is a very dominant group, of course, and the same goes for television. Just 3 channels dominate the market. I would like to show you also an interesting case, which is Portugal. You have seen maybe in the numbers that they score better than the others. It's a small country actually. Portugal doesn't have more than 10 million inhabitants, but they have 4 groups of national dominant media, and the local level is still not strongly affected by media concentration. That's also an interesting finding, that there are also countries where media concentration is not a dominant problem. Now, the last slide, please. My conclusions I would like to draw here are the following. So media concentration remains a constant feature of media markets over time. So this is something which doesn't go away, and it certainly didn't go away during the decade of digitalization. It is an ubiquitous feature across nations and continents. It's more pronounced in smaller states than in larger ones. It affects the local level more than the national level. And the negative effects of media concentration are by no means balanced by the digital intermediaries and digital platforms. It's responsibly moderated by public service media in those countries where there is public service media, and in our sample, in most of them, there are, and it requires constant monitoring. If you want to see more details on our study, all this is open access, so you can download these books in the complete version from the Nordicom thing. I'm very proud that we managed to get this really open access to everybody. So this is free and open access, so you can download the books, and you can see the website as well, where you can play around a little with the indicators and find the different countries. Now, one more slide I have, because I would like to make you aware of another research project which is currently running, and it's coming very soon. And that's a project we are currently doing in 15 European EU member states on media ownership. So the European Commission pays us to develop a database where we have, for the 15 countries now under survey, we look at the leading news media. And the database will be constructed in a way that you click on any kind of newspaper, for example, and then it pops up who are the owners, including the entire ownership chain. And this is something one would expect we all know already, who are the owners, but we don't. So if you look into that in a more structural way, you will find a network of owners which is intertwined between different media, different companies. You will find a lot of foundations at the end of the chain who owns the media. And I think this is a very important first step into more transparency for the European media landscape. We have developed the methodology how to find these kind of ownerships. And we are willing to share that. So if somebody in the audience or elsewhere is interested in joining the project, we might discuss and negotiate how you're going to use our methodology in order to have a broader picture here. And the European Commission actually asked us to do next year the other 12 member states of the European Commission. So by 2023, we will have all 27 countries of the European Union in this database, and we are going to present this in September, next month, for the first 15 countries. We will then get feedback and make the instrument maybe a bit smarter and better, and then we will have, for Europe, a database for the leading news media, which is at your fingertips, and all this kind of information will be publicly available. So I'm very proud of that project, and I'm very much looking forward to having feedback on that to make that a nice and important tool for our research. Thanks for your for listening.
Thank you, Josef. So our third speaker now, we've gone from France to 8 other countries, and now we have Mattia Galli from the Università Cattolica, the Sacro, Cuore, perhaps, but actually looking at the case of the internationalization of Italian TV broadcasting and its supply chain, the case history of Sky Italia. Come here. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure and honor being here with you today and presenting you the research carried out by the Italian branch of the GMIC project, represented by CERTA, the Research Center on Television and Audiovisual Media of the Catholic University in Italy. The paper will focus on the evolution of concentration trends within the television market in Italy, and in particular will highlight the key role of Sky Italia in the modernization of the sector and in the internationalization of the production side of the vertical supply chain. Next slide, please. Television has always been the central medium within the Italian media system, among those tracked by Agicom, the Italian Regulation and Competition Authority. And advertising has traditionally been the main revenue source for media in Italy. However, as we can notice, since 2010, the advertising revenue of the so-called traditional media has been plunging, while on the contrary, online advertising is on the rise, and in 2019, for the first time in history, it overcame the advertising revenue of television, and the gap between the two sectors is very likely to grow further in the years to come. Next slide, please. Just like in any other media system, television in Italy is founded by 3 main revenue sources. We got the fee collected by the government for the public service broadcasting, advertising, and paid television service subscriptions, which have been the real selling force of the market in the last 20 years, as you can see from the chart. Next, please. To properly comprehend the evolution of concentration trends within the Italian television market, it is useful to have a quick look, although essential, to the evolution of history of broadcasting in Italy, which started its long adventure back in 1954 with the beginning of public service broadcaster RAI, which operated under state monopoly until the beginning of the 80s, when, due to a vacuum in regulatory policies, private broadcasters started their operations. Most of these private broadcasters were later acquired by Fininvest, the holding company of then tycoon, now politician and three-time former Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who will later spin off its television activities in a new listed company called Mediaset. With a public service broadcaster and a private company, began what is called the imperfect duopoly. That is to say, these two companies basically control the whole market, while the remaining marginal shares were held by a very long tail of regional and local broadcasters. This situation was legitimized also from a jurisdictional point of view by the so-called Mammì Law in 1990, which legitimized the situation already in existence. This model, however, faced a saturation point at the end of the 90s. There was the compelling need to find alternative sources, such as subscriptions. In 2003, then, after having overseen the merging process of two local paid television services, News Corp, the company founded by Rupert Murdoch, created Sky Italia, which made popular paid television services in Italy too. With this market entry of this new big, huge international media giant, there was a need for new regulation policies on concentration trends. In 2004, then, the Gaspari Law established new concentration limits within the media markets, and also established a roadmap for the progressive switch-off to digital terrestrial television, a process which was completed in 2012 and opened the way to many new broadcasters within the Italian television system. Next slide, please. With this brief, although essential information, it should be now clear for you to understand the role that Sky Italia has had within the television market in the last 20 years. In 2002, that is to say 1 year before the launch of Sky Italia in Italy, the imperfect duopoly was basically still in existence, since Rai and Mediaset had a combined market share of 76%, while the other players were just marginal in the scenario. In 2004, which is the first full year of activity for Sky, which was launched in the summer of 2003, we can notice how the newly founded company already had a market share of 19%, and the total revenue of the market jumped of almost €1 billion in just 2 years' time. This is thanks to subscription fees collected by the new company. Next slide, please. In the following years, Sky Italia started eroding the market shares of both Rai and Mediaset, and in 2012, for the first time in a long history of broadcasting in Italy, an international player overcame traditional media company Rai and Mediaset, and the whole sector was estimated to be worth more than €8 billion, which for the Italian standards is a very huge and impressive number. In the following year, the situation became almost fixed. And in 2020, which is the last set of the data made available by Agicom, we can notice a decrease in the total revenue of the sector due to the ongoing economic crisis and especially the pandemic, which hit really hard the audiovisual sector in Italy. Despite the loss, Sky Italia still holds the throne of first player within the Italian television market, followed by Rai, Mediaset, and online video platforms, which are making their way in the Italian media industry too. Next slide, please. Sky Italia has contributed in enlarging the total revenue of the market, the television market in Italy. When it comes to its business model, however, it is quite a traditional one for a paid television service, since it is founded on the subscription fees collected from subscribers, advertising, which can guarantee around €200 million a year to the company, and other revenue sources. If we analyze the evolution of revenues from the very beginning of the company until 2020, we can notice a steady increase in the first years of life of the platform, followed by a slight decrease after 2010, which coincides with the beginning of one of the most severe financial crises Southern Europe has ever faced, followed by a plateauing period until 2019, which marked the year in which the company was bought by American Comcast Media Group, followed again by a decrease after that. If we take into account the evolution of the subscribing base instead, we notice somehow it mirrors somehow what we have already seen for revenues, since we got a steady increase in the first years, then a slight decrease, a plateauing period, and again a peaking point in 2019, the year in which Sky overcame the maximum point of 5 million subscribing households, which in the Italian media discourse has always been considered the maximum point reachable for a paid television service. In the following years, indeed, we can notice a severe decrease in subscribers. This is due to multiple factors. Again, the aforementioned economic crisis, the pandemic, but also the competition coming from new over-the-top services which can offer cheaper subscription plans to subscribers, and, for example, the loss of the Serie A football TV rights, which is the premium content in the Italian television sector, to over-the-top service DAZN. Next slide, please. Not only did Sky Italia had an impact on the economics of television in Italy, but it also had a huge and lasting effect on the vertical supply chain of content production and made the sector more and more internationalized. In its first years of life, Sky was mainly an aggregator of third-party content and channels for its subscribers. As the years passed, however, there was the need to create brand royalty to communicate its own brand and attract new potential subscribers, which are dubbed as prospects in the corporate jargon. So Sky started creating, producing, and distributing original scripted content. We are talking about TV series then, becoming a vertically integrated media company covering all the steps of the vertical supply chain. Next slide, please. In doing so, Sky wanted to create a network of international media partners to produce content that can be inherently international, that can easily travel anywhere around the world, and with high production value. This is why Sky, during the years, has collaborated with production companies such as Spanish Media Pro, French Banijay, other pay television services such as Canal Plus or American HBO, and German distributor Beta Film. Sky Italia has also helped in the creation of Sky Studios, which is not a proper production company. It is a central hub to supervise and coordinate production all over Europe. Next slide, please. It should not be surprised at this moment that with this new content produced by Sky, traveling anywhere around the world, international media giants have started to show interest in the production companies that have collaborated the most with Sky during the years. Wildside, for example, has been part of Mega Indie Fremantle since 2015, which in its turn is owned by Luxembourg-based RTL Media Group. Cattolica, which is a very important production company in Italy, it is the production company that has produced Gomorrah, which is the TV series that has traveled the most in the world produced in Italy, has been purchased in 2017 by ITV Studios, which is, of course, the production arm of British broadcaster ITV. Next slide, please. These were just some of the data the Italian branch of the GMIC project has been working on in the last 12 months. And I feel some conclusions can be drawn at this point. The first one is that in media industry studies, no matter what the focus of the research is, a systemic approach is essential in capturing and detecting all the trends going on both on a global and on a local scale. In this regard, GMICP sectors, as you all probably have learned in the last 12 months, should not be considered as isolated segments, but as deeply intertwined markets. An analysis such as that carried on about production, the internationalization of production companies, for example, couldn't have been made without a proper analysis of the evolution of concentration trends within the television market in Italy. The effect that Sky Italia has had on the evolution and modernization of the television market in Italy should now be clearer. It has helped making an otherwise fixed scenario more dynamic. It has reshaped a market that has been fixed for more than 20 years and has created a new production and distribution model which has been now copied by other European countries. Despite all this, the scenario is changing once again, and over-the-top video services are making their way in Italy like in other European countries. And although their penetration rate is not as higher as in other European or American countries, this is the area in which our research should focus in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mattia. And now we move to our online speakers, and we have two. I presume maybe we're going to share the presentation, but I would say this is on Finland, the state of media concentration in Finland. And we have Mikko Grönlund from the University of Turku and Tuomas Ranti also from the University of Turku. So we have about 15 minutes. You're probably not going to see me, so I'm going to have to Hope that you're also timing there. If you hear my voice from this direction on the microphone, you know you've got to the end of your time, okay?
Yes, okay, thank you. We try to be quick because we are the last presentation
Okay,
today.
thank you very much.
So good afternoon, or should I say good night, because in Finland it's already 30 past 11 p.m. So it's getting late here in Finland, and unfortunately we couldn't make it to Canada this time, but now we're going to go through a little bit what's the state of media concentration here in Finland. First, a little bit about Finland. So Finland, quite large country, the fourth largest in the European Union, but only 5.5 million people, and also divided by 2 official languages, Finnish and Swedish. And the mass media market in Finland, the volume in 2020 was approximately 3.8 billion euros. So it's not a huge market, it's quite a small market in European standards. And something about, we go next to the legal framework. So the Finnish legal framework, there is actually no special competition legislation for media to prevent any media ownership concentration or to protect the diversity of ownership. And also in Finland, we have no limitation in foreign ownership of media companies. That's been the Finnish approach since the 90s approximately. And if you take a broader approach to or view to the Finnish legislation, media companies are treated, at least the most part, as any other companies. So there is mainly no specific things for media companies in the Finnish legislation. And of course, we have the Finnish Competition and Consumer Authority, and during the last 20 years, they have given approximately 30 decisions related to media company acquisitions or mergers. And almost all of them have been approved as such. And in a couple of cases, they have just wanted to have some minor, more information on some very minor changes. So the intervention from the competition authorities during the last 20 years has been close to null or very limited or minimal. Something also about the distribution of media in Finland. The role of linear and non-linear distribution, of course, like in many Western Hemisphere countries, the non-linear distribution is also in rise in consumption in Finland, but somewhat sort of strangely in Finland, more households than in any other EU countries are dependent on mobile networks. So very many Finns use sort of mobile broadband even at home. And in the distribution of, for example, of digital terrestrial television, Digita Group, which is owned by the American Digital Bridge Group, has a monopoly kind of situation, both in television and radio sort of distribution. And a couple of years ago, they also took their first steps in pay TV business, but it haven't been very successful yet. But even though it seems to be that they are also coming to that field as well. And if you think about physical distribution of newspapers and magazines, the Posti Group, which is owned by the state of Finland, has a quite substantial proportion of that. And at the moment, the parliament is discussing, because of the high raises in the prices of distribution, that maybe they should give some subsidy to or distribution support of the physical sort of copies of newspapers. And the relevant non-linear distributors, the markets, both the fixed and sort of free broadband markets are dominated by 3 players: the Telia Finland, which is owned by Telia from Sweden, and then we have DNA, which is owned by the Norwegians, and then you have a Finnish company called Elisa. So it's 3 companies that dominate those 2 markets totally. And just to give a sort of quick look at how the top 12 sort of media companies in Finland look like, if you think about their turnover. So Sanoma is by far the biggest, with about 1 billion euros turnover, and Sanoma is in all the major areas of media, of course. And the second biggest is our public broadcaster, Yleisradio, which is, but compared to Yleisradio, Sanoma is approximately double the size. And as you can see, the Finnish standard big companies are still relatively small companies. And now we can a little bit talk about the concentration of print news media. And like Josef already mentioned, that in Finland there have been a lot of going on, and especially in print news media, it can be characterized by frequent mergers and consolidation. One of the which is slightly different from if you think about other medias in Finland, the print news media is still totally owned by Finnish companies. And one peculiarity is also that those media companies have quite a few cross ownerships, so they own a little bit of each other as well. And in Finland, if you talk about especially newspaper titles, there are only few that could be classified as national newspapers, like Helsingin Sanomat and a couple of tabloids, and then some special newspapers. But in practice, the Finnish markets are divided to 20 regional markets. And in those regional markets, which are the core of the Finnish print news media markets, they are mostly always dominated by one major companies, which have gained a monopoly-like position in the area. They have the number one, the regional daily. They have several or all the local newspapers. They have free papers. They may have a radio. They have all kind of online radio. So it's a very monopoly-like situation in the regions. And at the moment, if you think about the News Media Finland, which is the organization of the news media, one company, which is called Keski-Suomalainen, owns about 30% of the 234 titles. And the five biggest together own more than 50% of all newspaper or free paper titles in Finland. And then how about the concentration in radio and TV broadcasting? In Finland, the highest degree of concentration is in radio broadcasting, which is, once again, it's dominated by three key players. First, you have the public broadcaster, YLE, of course, owned by the state. Then, once again, Sanoma company and the German-owned Power Media Finland, and is part of the Bauer Group. And if you think about the private or the commercial radio, those two players, Sanoma and Bauer, they gain approximately 80% of all the revenues that goes to the private radio sector in Finland. So and the rest of the stations, they get the 20% and divided them. So they are really in dominant position in the commercial radio markets. Linear television, once again, we have Yleisradio, the public broadcaster, MTV, which is nowadays a subsidiary of the Telia company, which is also in the telecom business. And Telia, once again, 40% of the company is actually currently owned by the Swedish state. And then we have also in television markets, we have Sanoma is the third biggest player. We have smaller players, which are usually the subsidiaries of big international media groups like Disney and Discovery, but their share in Finland is still very small compared to the three big ones. Now I give the floor to Tuomas, and he will still say something about the games.
Yes, thank you, Mikko. So we decided to also provide a closer look at the quickly growing games industry, where Finnish companies are also very prominent actors. So like many media sectors, the games industry has been characterized of accelerated consolidation in the recent years. And game companies as such are companies that are basically born global. So it's also kind of natural that global giants get interested in those and maybe swallow them and or buy them out. And media companies have noticed the value of the games industry and the potential of games as part of their content delivery channel portfolios. And here we now present 3 cases from the Finnish games industry in order to illustrate some ownership developments from the games industry. So first off, we have Supercell, which was founded in 2010. And last year it had sales of 1.8 billion euros. And you may know Supercell from games such as Clash of Clans, Heyday, Brawl Stars. And it's 51% of its stock was sold to Japanese SoftBank in 2013 for 1.5 billion. And then they increased their ownership with further 23% in 2015. And then later on, 81% of Supercell was sold to Halti SA, of which Chinese Tencent owned half. And in 2019, Tencent increased their stake to 51% of the whole company. And by the way, Tencent is the largest company through which investments in the world in the games industry. So second, we have an example of a company which has had a different kind of ownership strategy. And it has strived to remain, or they have had as their strategy to remain independent and make their own decisions and then develop their strategies by themselves. However, even in this case, we can see that there is interest coming from these big giants. And in fact, last year, Tencent acquired 4% of Remedy. And right now, Remedy is collaborating with Tencent on a new multi-platform game franchise. And if you don't know Remedy by name, maybe you know their games, Max Payne, Control, and Alan Wake, which are, in contrast to these other examples, the Remedy is a developer of console games. These others are mobile games developers that we're having here. And third, we have an interesting case, Next Games, which is pretty small still, but with sales of 25 million. But this year, Netflix offered to buy the company for 63 million. And the reason for that is probably because Next Games has specialized in developing games based on popular TV series such as Walking Dead and Stranger Things. So Netflix has said that they are doing different kinds of trials into different sorts of services. So maybe this is just one trial and maybe they abandon it, maybe they develop it further. But recently we got data that today only like 1.7 million users out of Netflix total 221 million subscribers are engaging with these Netflix games, which Netflix offers at no extra cost to their subscribers. So it remains to be seen whether Netflix sticks with their games plan or not. So,
and then just to summarize sort of the situation in Finland, we could say that digitalization of content has challenged legacy media products, and this has contributed so that there have been a lot of exits in the market and also a lot of consolidation in different markets and different geographical markets also. Legal framework of media is based for the most part, as said, in general legislation. And one thing that we have with other colleagues been also sort of studying that the Finnish media policy has not actively aimed at preventing acquisitions or consolidation of any kind of ownership limitation or regulation. So the Finnish media policy during the last 20 years has been more like an ad hoc kind of thing. They react to things that happen that not very sort of planned or anything. DTT monopoly and exceptional dependency on mobile broadband and concentration of ownership is significant in all sectors of legacy media. However, there is no sort of one way how this has happened when there's several ways in different sort of sectors of the markets. There's been different ways of how it's gone during the last 20 years. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent timekeeping. That was absolutely to the point, so thank you very much. I'd like to remind our people who are watching online, I can see we still have people there listening away to us, that the Q&A is the box that you would put your questions into. I'm thinking that we'll probably be, depending on the energy in the room and online, trying to run on till about 5 o'clock and then allow time for people to take a break before the evening activities. And just a couple of things that strike me as you're thinking of some questions, and I'd encourage you, if you have a question and you're in the room, to move to the microphone. So, you know, we started with looking at France and looking at the case there, the three big key companies. Actually, some of my first games interviews were with Havas, which was part of Vivendi at the time, and they had quite significant game interests, particularly in console. Then we moved to looking at and I love the so why are we doing this, or the so what question, as we try to teach the students. Why are we doing this research? Not just collect numbers, but also some of the questions around democracy. And also in Europe, I suppose the other question that always comes up is around pluralism and cultural diversity. And then looking across the 8 countries, I think that's really interesting. Something that struck me, resonated with earlier in the day, that some of the trends for small countries and also for local dimension add some complexity to our studies. So, and that's very clear in some of the European case studies. And maybe one of the things we haven't mentioned, but does come up in classes that I teach, in the European context, is the geolinguistic kind of dimension. We know in Finland we have 2, at least, or 3 languages. In Ireland we're officially bilingual, but hugely dominated by the Anglophone media. And so I think that geolinguistic kind of complicates our questions as well, as to who's targeting and moving into the different markets. And then the final point, which kind of gets picked up, is that role of international players disrupting what had been quite stable markets for some time. Sky Italian market, very stable with the duopoly, and then Sky coming into it. And of course, Sky recognizing a real cultural phenomenon in many countries, moving into sports and sports rights as the driver for its subscription services. And it was really interesting to see the subscriber numbers just drop off after the crash, but also after they lost the rights to Serie A, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the main football league in Italy. So really interesting, thinking about the local, thinking about the international disruption in the European context. So I should look here and see if we have any online questions and answers. Nothing coming in yet. So I'll invite some people from the floor who might like to, even reflections at this stage as we come to the end of the first day. And I see Tracy has something for us. Thank you, Tracy.
I have a question for Josef in terms of ownership. One of the difficulties we have here in some of the sectors I look at, which is data brokers and data organizations, is a problem of actually the corporate registries are not open. Because Canada has not yet signed on to beneficial ownership to open these corporate registries so we can find out who the shareholders and the owners are of companies. Is this the same kind of context that you've encountered when you're looking for the owners of the big media companies? Yes or no? And what other kind of obstacles or ways have you discovered to try and find who the owners of these companies are? And thank you. That was really interesting to see all the really great work of the organizations you're involved with.
Yeah, thank you. You asked me yes or no? Yes. Now, the bit longer answer is indeed, we come across the problem of disguised ownership, actually. So in most of the 15 countries we have been looking at in this round of our research, the public data is available. So it's not always freely available, so you might have to pay for that. So you have to pay for access to the registry, but access is there. In some cases, universities have free access because they are universities, so that's not the main problem actually. What is more of a problem is that if you go into the details of the ownership chains, in many countries you arrive at the end as at a private foundation. And private foundations are, as a matter of fact and as a matter of their constitution, not public, they are private foundations. So it's often the case that you end up in a private foundation where you don't have any idea who is controlling the foundation. You might find names of the founder, but maybe the founder is dead already and the foundation is still there, but then you don't know who is controlling the foundations. So you end up in kind of in a mist where you don't really know where you are. Or you end up in really large companies, such as, for example, the Banque Santander in Spain. They are at the end of the ownership chain in Spain quite often. So it's a bank. So who then controls the bank? You might find out who controls the bank again. But what is the role of the bank owners along the ownership chain at the back end of the media? You don't really know whether the Banque Santander at the end of the day is going to exert any kind of control to the media they own at the end of the day. So these ownership chains can be pretty long, and this is one of the findings we have in our second research. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to sit down here to make it a little bit more informal. We have 2 questions online, and then I'll come back to you, Ellie, for the one here in the room. I'm giving due warning to our Finnish colleagues. There's some games question coming after this other question. So this actually is one of your co-authors, Josef, who is saying that Tuomas is saying that he's participating with you in the projects. We have wondered about which aspects of ownership we should consider when thinking about media ownership, transparency, and concentration. One issue is the types of ownership, like commercial or public, and this came up earlier today, or even governance. According to literature, this makes quite a difference in the control owners actually have over daily operation of the media. To what extent should we consider these different types of ownership when considering concentration? EX are countries where concentration exists, but of dominance by public service media as problematic as those with private commercial concentration. Should we somehow code this into our efforts to track media ownership concentration? Now, since you're the co-author with him, you probably have been struggling with this question, but I don't know if you have a comment, and then maybe one of our other colleagues have a comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, these are rhetoric questions from Thales, of course, because we have been struggling with that, and we are asking ourselves these kind of questions, and if anybody in the room would like to give us advice, we are very open to that. So these are these kind of tricky questions if you go into detail in media ownership. So it's not that easy as you might expect. Who owns the media? It's very, very difficult. And these fields where public service, for example, is involved, there is even more complicated, of course. Yeah. So I'm not going to answer the rhetoric questions of Thales.
Yeah,
Thanks, Thales, by the way.
Matti, what about in Italy? That's interesting, where you had the duopoly and then this international player coming in that is a private operator. Any reflections? This is not probably something you can answer exactly now.
Well, it's something we may find in the most experimental sector, for example. We do have the same problem in Italy for data brokers, for example. We do not know in Italy, those who operate within the data broker sector, who is the ultimate owner of the service. This is very tricky. We are working on it. It's been a very long work because we have to go back many steps to find out who is the ultimate owner. Something like this has happened many years ago also with newspapers. Some newspapers were owned by private foundations whose real owner in the end was the owner of other newspapers. So it's like it's a way to divert the attention of those who research the industries. That's not always the case, but it has happened in Italy too.
And in France, any reflections?
Yeah, so maybe a reflection about the public television in France, because as you know, there's a strong since the 50s after war a political will to develop and to maintain and to fund public TV channels. But also, when in the 80s, when François Mitterrand, socialist president, became president, he is the man who encouraged and motivated Hachette, so Vivendi, to create Canal+, the first private channel in France, because to him it was a strategy of creativity and international recognition. So these political and strategic dimensions are also important to think about the media, their role, which is not only financial or economic, but also cultural and political, I think.
And of course, at the European level, the cultural exemptions we often associate with France as, a reason to pivot. Yeah. Okay. So we are just moving to the next question here, which is from Guus van Drunen, and who's the author of a book on the games industry. And this is actually about the Finnish games industry. So considering the Finnish games industry, what role does an actively involved government play, pun intended, in managing concentration in such a sector? And then just followed up with, by active involvement, I'm referring to subsidies in this case. So I wonder, would one of our colleague maybe who spoke about games from Turku like to talk about something about the government support in this respect?
Yeah, I can. Of course, it's a bit difficult to say like this quickly, but I can say that the government, sure, they are trying to bring together small companies so that maybe they can join forces and that way more likely make it globally or on the wider market. And the government is much subsidizing the development within the games industry. And we have an industry organization called Neo Games, which is heavily involved in the games industry startups and development, and they are themselves also really well familiar with the industry. And with regard to these huge companies such as Supercell, maybe they're not so much anymore. Of course, they received a lot of support when they were still growing, but at this stage, they are their significance is much in the way that, for example, the owners of Supercell, they are paying all their taxes in Finland and setting an example also to the others. And they're not so much anymore asking, but they're giving, if I can summarize it. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, Ali, you wanted to ask a question. Ali, if you'd like to take the microphone, and then we have some more questions.
Observation and question. First, about the French situation. First, I kind of amazed at the media power that Bolloré has, number one, and number two, how little known that fact is outside of France. Let's say in Italy, with Berlusconi, everybody in the world knew about it, but Bolloré is kind of not a household name outside of France. But when you talk later about Mitterrand and the creativity, I think there's a story there. First, during de Gaulle and the subsequent period, the the TV networks were totally controlled by the government. And de Gaulle, in fact, used this as his major bullhorn against the print press, and Mitterrand changed that. He created that Canal Plus, but Canal Plus was also a monopoly, and in terms of private, in terms of independent pay TV, it charged prices that were 2 or 3 times as high as in America HBO or similar type channels were, because it was a monopoly. Canal Plus was controlled and ran by Mitterrand's former chief of cabinet and his personal attorney. He was the guy who ran it. And the money that was the monopoly profits from that channel were then distributed to French cultural organizations. So it created a monopoly situation with distribution, and that kind of gave an enormous political power over culture. So that is part of the story of the creativity that you described, right? Now, I have a question for Josef. I was really excited when you talked about the question whether, in fact, democracy is helped by media diversity, right? And I had hoped that you would develop that. You probably didn't have enough time to do that. Because the question really is there too much, if there's too, what is the optimal, the sweet spot for media diversity? Is there such a thing as too much diversity? And maybe one of the problems right now with the internet is, in fact, there are too many voices, and when there are too many voices, then they become sensationalist and loud and try to kind of get attention, and therefore they have less resources to do research in terms of investigative reporting and so on. So is it possible that there is such a thing as an optimal media diversity? And historically, I can remember that in 1920s or so in Germany, there was more media diversity than there was in Britain. And yet you saw where that went to. It did not go into democracy, but it went to kind of totalitarianism. And so the media diversity per se does not seem to guarantee anything. In fact, it could be the result of a fractured society.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. I'm sure you are aware of the American economist in the 1920s, which is called hotelling. And hotelling's effect exactly describes what you're saying here. So there can be too much diversity indeed, because then we have a middle of the road effect coming up. So if there are too small companies, they are all kind of arranging in the middle of the road because they all try to get the share of the market, and that does not create diversity at all. So in that sense, indeed, we know since 100 years actually that there can be too much diversity as well. And in fact, what we are doing, I think, all over the place, is to find the optimum between too little diversity and too much diversity. But too much diversity is not really a problem. It pops up now again in the internet, as you say, and it provides an argument for the large industries to say, okay, we are balanced anyway because the internet allows everybody to speak and everybody has a voice there. But the counter-argument, as Hindman and others have argued, is that you can speak up in the internet, but if nobody listens, the effect is zero. So what we see is, on the one hand, a concentration of power and influence and voice within the intermediaries and the large companies, and on the other hand, we have the internet, which is an area where everybody can speak, but nobody listens. So in that sense, I think we need to find, indeed, the balance between too much and too little diversity. So yes, I agree, and this is what we're searching for. Where is the optimum?
And just picking up 2 comments that are coming in, I'm going to take them in the reverse order, actually, because Peter Thompson, who many of you will know in the room, is just saying, following on from the very useful question about the differentiation of public service versus commercial media, might we also need to consider emerging media services which ostensibly increase diversity but espouse problematic political ideologies, for example, GB News in the UK? So might we see decreasing concentration correlating with declining democratic functionality and representation in the overall media ecology? So here again, something similar point really. I suspect we're picking this up again tomorrow in our discussions. So Peter, if you bear with us, that's probably something we're going to come back to. And just the kind of final comment I'm going to leave to Janet Wasco, who many of you again will know in this audience, who is enjoying the discussion very much of media ownership and challenges of doing research in this area, and it's greatly appreciated from her side. So she's been trying, obviously, to do this work for many years. It's good to hear about such good research from everybody here. Very interesting and great discussions during the first day of the conference. I think that's a really nice place to perhaps call this session to an end, and thank everybody, thank our speakers for their contributions and keeping to time. Thank our Finnish colleagues for staying up late and contributing to the discussions. Hopefully see you in person next time. And thank you to everybody online for your comments and questions. We invite you to join us again tomorrow, and we're all going to go off and do some other types of activities now, I think, in the evening. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thanks, Aphra.